Security dragged a quiet black man out of the most luxurious hotel in the city because they believed he simply did not belong there. Guests laughed. Phones came out. Someone whispered, "Another scammer trying his luck." The man never argued, never raised his voice, never reached for his wallet to prove anything to anyone. He simply stood in the falling snow, holding a worn leather bag against his chest, his breath rising in slow, patient clouds above his head. Then, a convoy of black SUVs stopped at the entrance, their headlights cutting through the winter dark like the arrival of something inevitable. The hotel's glamorous owner stepped out, wrapped in a camel coat, every inch of her the picture of composed authority. Everyone expected her to survey the situation and demand the man's arrest, to have security do their job properly this time. Instead, she stopped cold the moment her eyes found him. She crossed the distance between them in seconds, ignoring every watching face, ignoring the cameras, ignoring the stunned silence of her own staff. She wrapped her arms around him with the kind of force that comes only from years of suppressed longing, and she pressed her lips close to his ear and whispered words that froze every person in that lobby completely solid. "My brother, I have been looking for you for 15 years." The night had come in fast and mean over Manhattan, the way winter nights do when they mean business. By 6 o'clock, the sky had gone the color of a bruise, and the snow that had been threatening all afternoon finally began to fall in thick, deliberate sheets across the avenue. On Fifth Avenue, the Alderton Grand stood lit from within like a lantern. 7 stories of Italian marble, floor-to-ceiling glass, and a reputation so polished it practically glowed in the dark. The hotel had hosted heads of state, celebrated film stars, 3 former presidents, and this particular evening it was preparing to host the annual Meridian Business Summit, a gathering of the city's most influential financial minds. Bellboys in black coats moved with choreographed urgency along the front steps. A string quartet had been assembled near the entrance of the main lobby. Champagne was already chilled and arranged in rows behind the bar, each glass standing at precise attention. Every detail had been curated with the kind of obsessive precision that communicates one message without ambiguity and without apology. This is a place where certain people belong and certain people do not. The Alderton Grand had never needed to say this out loud. It communicated it through marble and light, through the cut of its staff uniforms, through the practiced expressions on the faces of people paid to recognize, within 3 seconds of looking at a guest, where that guest belonged in the hierarchy of the evening. Marcus Webb walked through the front door at 6:47. He was 39 years old and built like a man who had spent his life doing things that required his body to be reliable rather than impressive. His shoulders were broad, his hands rough at the knuckles from real use over many years, and the winter coat he wore was a dark navy that had once been well cut, but had faded through honest seasons into something that simply kept the cold out, with no interest in making a statement. He carried a single leather bag, old and soft with handling, the kind of bag that has traveled and holds things that matter. He walked to the front desk without hurrying, without looking around at the chandeliers overhead or the gilt-edged mirrors or the marble columns that framed the lobby like the architecture of consequence. He walked like a man who knows where he is going, which is to say, he walked like a man who does not need the room to approve of him first. When the desk clerk, a young man named Derek, whose smile was professionally calibrated for exactly this kind of moment, looked up and took in the coat, the bag, the unhurried face, something shifted behind his eyes in the particular way that prejudice shifts when it is activating itself while still maintaining plausible deniability. The smile remained, but it tightened at the corners, and the quality of attention it offered changed from welcome to appraisal. Marcus asked for a room. A single. One night, he said it quietly, the way a man says things when he has no reason to perform loudness or justify himself with volume. Derek's eyes moved slowly and visibly from Marcus's face to his coat to his bag and back again, making the calculation visible to anyone paying attention. And there were people paying attention, because the lobby of the Alderton Grand on the evening of the Meridian Business Summit was full of people who had come specifically to see and be seen, and a man at the front desk, who did not look like the other guests at the front desk, was a kind of disruption in the visual register that drew eyes. Raymond Howell, the evening's duty manager, had been watching from across the floor since the moment Marcus entered. Raymond was a man who considered the lobby his personal jurisdiction, and intruders in that jurisdiction his personal responsibility to handle. He crossed the floor now, with the smooth authority of someone who has made this kind of approach many times and has learned to make it look like service rather than removal. His voice, when he spoke, was smooth and just loud enough to carry to the nearest guests. "Sir, I think there may be some confusion about what kind of establishment this is." 3 nearby guests turned immediately. A woman in pearls leaned toward her companion and murmured something behind her hand. A man in a charcoal blazer actually reached for his phone, which was already, apparently, a reflex for moments that might be worth documenting. Raymond continued, louder now, because the arithmetic of these moments changes with an audience. "We have a very exclusive event this evening, and I'm afraid we cannot accommodate walk-in requests at this time." The implication was not subtle. It was not designed to be subtle. Subtlety would have wasted the audience. Marcus looked at Raymond for a long moment, with eyes that held no anger, only the patient clarity of a man who has seen worse injustice than this, and has survived it without being diminished by it, and who is therefore not particularly destabilized by a hotel manager. With a point to prove to a lobby full of wealthy guests, he said, simply and without accusation or heat or performance of any kind, "I only wanted a room." Those 5 words landed in a space that had gone partially quiet, and they were met with laughter, a ripple of it, from the guests nearest the desk, quickly and insufficiently stifled, in the way that people stifle laughter. They understand they shouldn't be having, but cannot quite convince themselves to suppress, when they are surrounded by others who are also almost laughing. 2 uniformed security officers appeared within 30 seconds, arriving with the practiced timing of a choreography they had performed before. They did not grab or shove. They were too professional for that, but they were absolute in the positioning of their bodies and the direction of their attention, and the message of their presence was as clear and as final as a locked door. Marcus did not argue. He did not demand to speak to someone above Raymond. He did not raise his voice or his hands or his chin. He picked up his leather bag from where he had set it on the floor near the desk, turned toward the exit with the same unhurried gravity with which he had entered, and walked back out into the snow. The lobby recovered its rhythms within 60 seconds. The string quartet resumed. The champagne continued to chill. Outside, Marcus pulled the collar of his coat up against the wind, set the bag down on a stone ledge near the entrance, and sat. What no one in that lobby knew about Marcus Webb, what Derek, with his calibrated smile, did not know, what Raymond Howell, with his territorial authority, did not know, what the woman in pearls and the man with his phone recording could not have imagined, was the particular and exact shape of the life contained within the worn Navy coat. Marcus had spent 8 years serving with the Federal Emergency Management Agency's Urban Search and Rescue Division, deployed to disasters up and down the eastern seaboard, and twice to the Gulf Coast in the aftermath of hurricane seasons that had left whole communities dissolved. He had pulled people from rubble in the dark, from floodwater that moved with a lateral force that could take a building off its foundation, from collapsed structures in situations where the margin between finding someone alive and not finding them alive was measured in minutes. He was not decorated in the official sense. He had turned down 2 commendations because the ceremony of being formally honored for doing what he considered simply the obvious thing was a kind of embarrassment. He did not know how to comfortably perform. But the people who had served alongside him spoke about him the way people speak about someone whose presence made them braver than they believed they were capable of being. After leaving the agency, Marcus had returned to civilian life with the same quietness that characterized everything else about him. He lived in a modest apartment in Baltimore, worked periodically as a structural assessor for a nonprofit that helped lower-income families repair homes after storm damage, and spent the balance of his time doing the kind of work that does not appear on any official resume because it is not done for credit or recognition or anything that can be converted into either. He organized supply drives in his neighborhood. He drove elderly neighbors to medical appointments on his days off. He mentored a rotating group of young men in his building whose fathers were absent or incarcerated or both, young men who needed someone to show up consistently and without agenda which was the one thing Marcus Webb had always known, instinctively and without instruction, how to do. He did none of this with proclamation. He simply did it. The way a person does the things they have come to understand actually matter. The leather bag he carried tonight contained, among practical items, a folder of documents, grant applications for a community shelter program in Baltimore, 3 letters of recommendation he was delivering in person to a partner organization in New York, and a few personal papers he kept with him always, regardless of how long or short the trip. Among those personal papers was a photograph. It was old, slightly creased along one edge. Its colors faded to the warm amber tones that analog photographs acquire with age and light, and it showed 2 people standing outside a high school gymnasium in South Carolina. Marcus, younger then, still in partial rescue gear, and a young woman with dark eyes and an expression on her face that people who have just been pulled from the specific kind of disaster that strips everything ordinary away sometimes carry. The look of someone who has understood, very recently and very completely, what the absence of help feels like, and then understood what its presence can do. He took the photograph out sometimes when he was alone, looked at it, and put it away. He had been looking for the woman in that photograph for a long time. He sat now on the stone ledge outside the Alderton Grand, with snow accumulating gently on the shoulders of his coat, settling into the dark navy fabric with the patient indifference of weather, which does not make distinctions based on who a person is, or what they have done, or how much money they carry. His expression was calm, in the way that very still water is calm, not empty, but settled at a depth that surface conditions cannot reach, a depth built over years of choosing equanimity, not because the alternative was unavailable, but because equanimity was more useful to the people he spent his life helping. He was not thinking about the lobby, or the manager, or the laughter that had rippled through the room after his 5 quiet words. He was thinking about the grant application folded inside his bag, about whether the financial projections he had reformatted the week before would satisfy this particular foundation's specific and somewhat idiosyncratic requirements, about whether he had remembered to include the supplemental documentation about the shelter's intake numbers from the previous calendar year, which had been higher than projected and therefore represented a stronger case. He was thinking about a family in East Baltimore he had visited. Before leaving for New York, a mother and her 2 children who had been on the shelter's waiting list for 11 weeks while the funding uncertainty dragged on, and about whether there was anything he had not yet tried that might accelerate the gap. The cold was real and present, and he was aware of it, but it was not unbearable. He had sat in considerably worse, in conditions where the cold was the least of what was wrong with the situation, and he had learned long ago that the body, given the choice between enduring discomfort and collapsing under it, will nearly always choose endurance if the mind provides it with a reason. The convoy arrived at 7:14, moving along Fifth Avenue with the close formation efficiency of vehicles that travel together often enough to have developed a rhythm. 4 black SUVs, their windows dark, the kind of motorcade that causes people on sidewalks to pause and recalibrate their sense of what is happening around them. The Alderton Grand's entire front staff materialized as if produced by the occasion itself: bellboys, doormen, the 2 security officers who had recently been inside performing a different function, Raymond Howell in position at the top of the steps, all of them arranged along the entrance with the collective posture of people who are performing, primarily for each other, their awareness of the importance of the moment. The first SUV stopped at the base of the steps with the precision of a vehicle that knows exactly where it is supposed to stop, and the driver moved with practiced speed to the rear door. Amelia Voss stepped out into the winter air. She was 41, though she carried herself with the kind of presence that makes age irrelevant as a unit of measurement in determining how a person registers in a room. She was the founder and principal owner of the Voss Hospitality Group, which operated 11 hotels across the country and was in active negotiations to acquire 3 more. She had built the company from a single boutique property in Charleston that she purchased at 26 with money accumulated through 8 years of work, that began when she was 17 and waiting tables in a diner outside Savannah, Georgia, work she had done with the focused urgency of someone who understands at 17 that the distance between where she is and where she intends to be is not going to close itself, and that the only instrument available for closing it is her own sustained effort, applied every day, without the luxury of waiting for conditions to improve. She was known in the industry for her standards, for an instinct that industry observers described as almost uncomfortably accurate, and for a quality of attention she brought to everything she observed, a tendency to notice details that other people in her position had learned, through years of elevation and insulation, to stop registering. She noticed things about people. She noticed things about spaces. She noticed, with an accuracy that sometimes unsettled those around her, when something was wrong. She walked toward the entrance of the Alderton Grand, with the forward momentum of a person who always has somewhere specific to be and knows exactly how long it will take to get there and what she needs to accomplish when she arrives. She was almost at the top of the front steps when she saw him. Marcus was still sitting on the stone ledge to the left of the entrance, his bag at his feet, snow on his shoulders, looking at something in his lap, with the concentrated quiet of a man accustomed to his own company and comfortable in it. Amelia stopped so completely and so suddenly that the assistant behind her nearly walked into her back. The color left her face, then it came rushing back. Her eyes went wide and bright, in a way that had nothing to do with professionalism or the management of composure or any of the several qualities she had spent years deliberately cultivating in herself. She said something under her breath that no one close enough to hear would later be able to reconstruct with confidence, because it came out half breath and half word, the kind of sound that precedes the realization catching up to the body. Then she moved. She walked down the steps and across the cleared stone toward him without looking at anyone else, without acknowledging the lineup of staff or their carefully arranged posture, without modulating her pace for the benefit of the audience that had immediately formed in the lobby windows above. She said his name. Marcus looked up. For one suspended moment, recognition traveled between them, like a current completing a circuit that had been open and waiting for 15 years. Then she was beside him, and her arms were around him, and she was holding on with the full force of someone who had learned not to hold on to things too tightly and had been holding back from this particular thing for a very long time. Her voice, when she found it, came out pressed against his shoulder. "My brother, I have been looking for you for 15 years. No one standing in the lobby, or arranged on the steps, or watching through the glass of the street-level windows, could understand what they were witnessing. What they saw was the woman who owned the building embracing, with emotion that had clearly not been prepared or managed, the man who had just been removed from that building for not belonging there. The distance between those two facts, the removal and the embrace, was not something that could be resolved by any assumption available to the people watching it. It simply had to be held, unresolved, while the evidence of their own eyes continued to accumulate. To understand what Amelia felt in that moment, the particular compound of grief and relief and joy that compressed 15 years into a single second, it is necessary to go back to a September that began as a late summer lull along the South Carolina coast and became, within 48 hours, one of the most destructive flood events in the recorded history of the region. The storm had been tracked and categorized, the warnings had been issued, but warnings, even accurate ones, even well-disseminated ones, do not always reach the people who need them in time, or with enough specific detail to make the necessary decisions feel obvious rather than excessive. Amelia had driven out of Charleston on the morning the storm made landfall to check on a small rental property she owned in a low-lying area 6 miles inland, a decision motivated by the reasonable concern of a young business owner protecting a property that she could not afford to lose, and by an underestimation of how fast the water would move, and how completely it would erase the distinction between a road and a field and a yard and a ditch. By the time she understood that she needed to leave, the road she had driven in on no longer existed as a navigable surface. The rental property became an island. The water came inside. It rose. She had been on the roof for 4 hours when the rescue team arrived. The flood by then was the color of red clay, moving with a lateral force that made the ordinary geometry of the land roads, property lines, the defined boundaries between places invisible and meaningless beneath it. Marcus Webb was the first member of the team to reach her, crossing the water in an inflatable rescue boat with his team's radio crackling at his back, and he climbed onto the roof beside her, with a calmness that she would later understand was not the absence of adrenaline, but the product of training applied over and over until the body's panic response is subordinated to something more useful, the particular competence that makes difficult. Things look quiet. He helped her into the boat. He stayed close to her during the transit back to the staging area, not performing reassurance or providing information she didn't need, but present in the specific and unmistakable way that makes a person feel less alone in the center of a situation that would otherwise be entirely isolating. The staging area occupied the gymnasium of a high school 7 miles from the flood zone, its basketball court covered with cots and supplies and the particular organized noise of mass emergency response. The evacuation of the surrounding area was slow. Amelia had a mild concussion she had not yet identified as such, a cut on her forearm from the metal edging of the roof, and a variety of shock that was not the dramatic, cinematic kind, but the quiet variety, the kind that settles into a person when the body has been running on emergency chemistry for hours, and the chemicals have begun, finally, to metabolize into something more like exhaustion than adrenaline. Marcus's shift had technically concluded when the boat returned her to the staging area. He stayed anyway. He found her dry socks from the supply bins and brought them without announcement. He brought coffee. He sat across from her in the gymnasium bleachers, while the noise of other people's displacement filled the enormous space around them. Other rescues arriving, other people being processed through the logistics of sudden homelessness, and he talked to her in the unhurried and even way that some people have, the way that does not ask for anything back, that simply offers the sound of a human voice as a kind of tether to ordinary life. They talked through the night, not primarily about the flood or the rescue or the roof, but about everything adjacent and beyond her hotel in Charleston, still young and precarious, still full of her own savings and her own risk. His work, which he described not as heroism, but as logistics that requires a high tolerance for conditions that are incompatible with normal operating assumptions. His grandmother in Baltimore, who made the best crab cakes he had ever eaten anywhere, and who had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 11, a woman who had managed, through the specific alchemy of practical love, to give him the foundation he needed to become someone capable of showing up for other people as reliably as she had shown up for him. Amelia's childhood in Savannah, the diner where she poured coffee at 5 in the morning before school, the specific quality of ambition that grows in people who have been made to feel, by circumstance or by the direct opinion of others, that they do not have enough and are not enough, and who have decided, quietly and with great certainty, to disagree with that assessment. At some point before the light began to change outside the gymnasium windows, in the particular tenderness that exhaustion and shared extremity produce in people who have let their defenses down, not out of weakness, but out of genuine safety, Amelia had said that she thought of him as the brother she had never had. Marcus, who did not give that word lightly, and who did not say things he did not mean, had said the same of her. They were not being sentimental. They were being accurate. There are people who become family not through blood or proximity or the long accumulation of ordinary time, but through the specific conditions of a single moment that strips everything performed and habitual away and shows you, with unusual clarity, who a person actually is underneath what they have learned to present to the world. When the evacuation vehicles finally moved Amelia to a medical facility 2 days later and Marcus was redeployed further into the field, they had exchanged contact information with the confidence of people who fully intend to use it. But disasters are not organized around the convenience of human connection. In the weeks that followed the chaos of recovery operations that stretched months beyond their initial scope, Amelia's urgent return to her business and its precarious finances, a phone number that changed when Marcus was redeployed to a different region, the thread between them broke. She had tried to find him through the agency, through colleagues who knew him, through every channel available to her. But Marcus moved through the world with a quietness that made him genuinely difficult to locate unless he chose otherwise, and he, for his part, had assumed that she had returned to the life she had described in the gymnasium, the hotel, the ambition, the forward momentum, and would not particularly welcome an intrusion from someone she had known for 48 extraordinary hours, and who represented, perhaps, a period she would prefer to leave behind. 15 years had passed. She had built something from nothing. He had continued, largely invisible to the world and entirely visible to the people he helped, to do the work he had always done. Amelia brought Marcus inside through the executive entrance on the side of the building, bypassing the lobby and its assembled observers, and she brought him to the principal suite on the 7th floor that she kept permanently reserved for her own use when she was in the city. She ordered food. She sat across from him at the table by the window, and for some time neither of them said very much, because the territory of 15 years of absence is not efficiently mapped by words, particularly when what both people most need is simply to confirm, through the physical reality of proximity, that the other person is actually there. The quiet between them was not uncomfortable in the way that silence is uncomfortable between people who do not know each other. It was the quiet of people who know each other in a way that is built not from accumulated time, but from a single experience of complete honesty, and who discover, returning to it after years, that this kind of knowledge does not expire. It was Amelia who thought about the camera footage, and the thought came to her not as a desire for revenge, but as the responsibility of someone who runs 11 hotels and needs to understand precisely what had happened in her lobby and under whose authority. She called her head of security and made the request with the directness that characterized every professional communication she made. 30 minutes later, she was watching the recording in the small conference room adjacent to the suite, and Marcus was beside her, and they watched it together in silence. The footage was complete and unambiguous. It captured Derek's smile, tightening at the desk. It captured Raymond Howell's deliberate crossing of the lobby with the momentum of a man performing his jurisdiction. It captured the two loud words, the visible appraisal of the coat, the positioning of the security officers. It captured the laughter from nearby guests and the phone already raised before the security officers arrived. It captured Marcus on the stone ledge in the snow, his breath slow and visible, his expression containing not the collapse of dignity, but the patience of someone who has made peace with living in a world that makes these kinds of errors repeatedly, and who has decided that peace is more useful than the peace alternative. Amelia watched all of it without speaking. When the footage ended, she sat for a moment in the silence of someone using silence as a container for something that would otherwise be difficult to govern. Then she said, very quietly and very clearly, "Who gave anyone the right to judge him?" Marcus said quietly that he would prefer she not make too significant a matter of it. He was fine. These things happened. He did not hold it against anyone in particular. This response, entirely sincere, delivered without a trace of self-pity or theatrical forgiveness, was the thing that made Amelia's composure most difficult to maintain, because she recognized in it the specific grace of a person who has spent so long doing good things, without recognition, that the absence of recognition has simply become the medium through which he moves, the atmosphere he inhabits so completely that he no longer notices its weight. She did not agree with his preference, but she heard it, and she sat with it for a moment before she told him that she understood, and that she would handle it as she determined it needed to be handled, and that she hoped he would trust her judgment in this the way she trusted his in the things he knew. The morning after, Amelia convened the staff, the full morning shift, the management team, the security detail, Derek from the front desk, Raymond Howell, in a tie that appeared to have been selected and knotted with extra care, as though an exceptional appearance might function as a kind of preemptive defense. Amelia did not hold the meeting in a conference room or an office. She held it in the lobby, the same space, the same marble, the same chandeliers, and she had a chair placed in the center of the floor, and she asked Marcus to sit in it. He did so with the particular self-contained dignity of a man doing something slightly ceremonial because he trusts the person who asked him, and that trust turns out to be sufficient reason. Amelia stood beside him and addressed the assembled staff with a directness that removed any ambiguity about what she felt and what she expected. She told them who Marcus Webb was not in the currency of credentials or formal recognition, but in the language of history and debt. She told them about the September flood, about the roof, about the gymnasium, about the night that lasted until dawn, and the conversation that covered the ground of 2 entire lives. She told them about the word that had passed between them in the gymnasium, brother, sister, and what it had meant and what it continued to mean. And then she said what she had been building toward, what she needed every person in that room to understand in a way that would not leave when they left the lobby. If this man had not stayed, not rescued me, that was his assignment, but stayed if he had not remained and been present, and treated me like a person whose company was worth having in the middle of a disaster, I am not certain I would have gone back to Charleston with enough of myself intact to do the work that built this hotel. And if I had not gone back and done that work, this hotel would not exist, not 1 square foot of it. She paused, and the lobby held its silence the way marble holds cold completely and without effort. If he hadn't saved me, she said, none of this would exist. Raymond Howell stood in the assembled group, and his face underwent a series of small and private adjustments that moved him, visibly, through something that appeared to be genuine rather than performed. The process of accountability that followed was not punitive in the simple sense. Amelia did not immediately terminate anyone. What she required was harder than termination in some respects. She required each staff member involved, Raymond, Derek, the security officers, the guests who had been identified from the camera footage, to engage in individual conversations with her, and with a facilitator she brought in specifically for this purpose, conversations designed not to prosecute, but to examine. Why does the mind, at the moment of looking at a man in a worn coat, go where it went? What is the source of the calculation? What experience or assumption is it protecting? What does it cost the person on the other end of it? The conversations were long and often uncomfortable. Some of them were, by subsequent accounts of the people who had them, among the more genuinely honest exchanges they had been required to have in a professional setting. Raymond Howell, to his considerable credit, did not retreat into the defensiveness that might have been the easier option. He said, in the course of his conversation with Amelia, that he had looked at Marcus and made a determination within the first 3 seconds, not even a decision, really, more like a reflex that the man was going to complicate his evening, and he had acted to prevent that complication before he had gathered a single piece of actual information. He said this with what appeared to be real discomfort, the discomfort of someone who has recognized something about himself that he does not find acceptable. Amelia said she appreciated his honesty, and then she said that his honesty was precisely where the work needed to start, because if it had happened to Marcus Webb on a Tuesday evening in November, it had happened to other people on other evenings, and it would happen again unless something in the culture of the hotel changed at a level that reached all the way down to the reflex. The program she built from those conversations became, over the following months, a new operating standard across the entire Voss Hospitality Group. Every employee at every property went through what Amelia called, without irony or corporate, softening the first 3 seconds training. Not a generic implicit bias module, though it incorporated those frameworks and their research, but something more specific and more demanding, a practice of recognizing the moment of automatic judgment and developing the capacity to interrupt it before it becomes action. She brought in external facilitators and internal champions, and she made the training mandatory, beginning with herself, attending the first session alongside her frontline staff, with the deliberate visibility of a person who understands that culture is set from the top and communicated in every direction simultaneously. She revised the check-in protocols at every property to remove visual presentation from any discretionary decision. She created a clear escalation procedure that gave staff an alternative to assumption in any situation where they felt uncertain about how to proceed. She announced a zero-tolerance policy for dismissiveness, in any form, toward any guest, regardless of appearance or presentation. It was not, she said to the journalists who called after word of the changes began to circulate through the hospitality industry, a perfect solution. It was a beginning, and beginnings, she had learned through the experience of building something from nothing more than will and work, were the only thing you could honestly commit to. Marcus stayed at the Alderton Grand for 3 days. He and Amelia talked through long evenings and occasional mornings, filling in the years they had each missed of the other's life. And it was during these conversations that she understood, in detail, the full shape of what he had been doing since the September they had shared. The deployments, the disasters in other states and other seasons, the people he had pulled through situations that did not make the news, because disasters only make the news at scale, and the suffering within them is individual and invisible. She heard about the grant applications in his bag, the shelter in Baltimore whose funding operated on an uncertainty that was incompatible with the people depending on it. She asked him, with the directness that was simply her nature, and that she had long since stopped apologizing for, what he needed. He told her he needed nothing. She said that wasn't the question she had asked. He sat with the actual question for a while. The quality of stillness in him was such that being asked to want something for himself required genuine effort, and then he said that what he wanted, not for himself but for the work, was for the shelter in Baltimore to have a stable and permanent source of operating funds, because the families who depended on it could not absorb the gap between the end of one grant cycle and the beginning of the next. Amelia did not respond immediately. She sat with it the way she sat with significant decisions completely, without rushing away from the discomfort of not yet knowing, and then she said, "I will fund it, not through grant cycles, through the Voss Foundation, as a permanent named program." She said, "What do you want to call it?" Marcus was quiet for longer than the question seemed to require. Then he said, "The Brother Promise," because a promise was what it had been, in a gymnasium, in South Carolina, in the hours before dawn. And brother was what they were. Several months passed, and in those months the Alderton Grand became, in the particular way that institutions become things, when the people inside them have been genuinely changed, rather than merely instructed, a different place than it had been before. A November evening when a man in a worn coat sat on a stone ledge in the snow, and a woman ran toward him from the steps of her own building. Not different in its appearance, the marble was still marble, the chandeliers still held their positions in the ceiling, the menu in the dining room still offered preparations that required descriptions longer than the dishes themselves, but different in the quality of attention that moved through the space, in the quality of presence that the staff brought to the simple and repeated act of looking at a person who walked through the door and determining, before anything else, what that person might need. Guests noticed, without always being able to identify what precisely they were noticing, that the hotel felt different in some way that went beyond the physical. Hospitality publications wrote about it in the abstract language such publications use for things they want to credit without fully explaining. Amelia gave a single interview about the changes, and she was precise and unadorned in her language, and she did not describe what had happened in November as a crisis or a learning opportunity or a chance for growth. She described it as a correction. Most places, she said, needed corrections of this kind. Most places found reasons not to make them. The Alderton Grand had made one, and the work of sustaining it was ongoing and would remain ongoing, because that was the nature of actual change as opposed to announced change. The Brother Promise Shelter program in Baltimore opened its extended programming wing in the spring, and Marcus was there for the opening, in the way he was always present for things not at the front of the room, not behind a podium, not in any position that required him to receive attention, but among the families the program served, sitting in a folding chair, next to a father from East Baltimore who had lost most of his ground floor to flooding the previous autumn and had been navigating the gap between the disaster and the recovery with the particular exhaustion of a crastaswanti, person who cannot afford to stop. Amelia flew in for the opening. She stood beside Marcus while he talked with the man, and she watched him the way she had watched him in the gymnasium 15 years before, with the particular attention of someone who is learning, in real time, something essential about how to be a human being, by watching another human being be one without any effort or awareness of the instruction being given. They remained in each other's lives after that, in the way that real connections persist, imperfectly, without agenda, but with a continuity that neither of them had to work to maintain, because the foundation of it was solid enough not to require maintenance, and honest enough not to require management. Marcus came to New York twice more that year. Amelia went to Baltimore once, and then again. And each time she went, she understood a little more clearly the landscape that Marcus had been moving through for 15 years. The specific texture of need in communities that exist outside the attention of people with the resources to respond to it, and the specific quality of presence required to respond to that need not as an intervention or a project, but as a simple and ongoing act of showing up. She brought her foundation's program director with her on the second visit, and together they walked through the shelter's intake area and sat with 3 families in the common room and listened, which is a skill Amelia had spent considerable effort developing in herself, because listening at the level that actually hears what a person is saying, rather than what you expect them to say, requires a willingness to be surprised, and surprise requires the prior admission that you do not already know. They did not make a project of their relationship or perform it for any audience. They simply kept it, the way things of genuine value are kept with care applied quietly and without ceremony. They still called each other the same names they had first used in a high school gymnasium in South Carolina at 4 in the morning, 15 years before names chosen not from sentiment but from accuracy, in the way that the best names for things are always chosen. Brother, sister. Not because they shared blood or legal designation or geography or any of the conventional structures through which family is normally understood and recognized, but because those words had been accurate then, in the specificity of what they had meant to each other in that moment, and they were accurate now, and accuracy in matters of real affection is the only thing that holds over time. There was a day in late winter, several months after the events of November, when Marcus came to the Alderton Grand again. He came through the front entrance. Amelia had been clear that this was how he would come, and he had, with mild amusement, agreed. He walked across the marble floor with the same unhurried quality that had always characterized his movement through spaces, the same self-contained gravity, the same complete indifference to the room's opinion of him. He was carrying the same leather bag, worn and traveled. His coat was different from the one he had worn in November, newer, dark wool, well-cut, the kind of coat that is clearly a gift from someone with better taste in coats than the recipient, accepted because refusing it would have required more argument than it was worth. He walked to the front desk, where a clerk named Sophia was on duty, a young woman who had been through the training program and who looked up when Marcus approached with an expression of genuine welcome, not the professional facsimile of it, not the tightened smile of someone running a calculation, but the actual thing, the kind that happens in the face before the professional layer has time to intervene. She said, "Welcome to the Alderton Grand. Are you checking in?" And Marcus said yes, and she processed his reservation with the clean efficiency of someone who finds satisfaction in doing something correctly. And she handed him a key card and told him the elevator was to his left, and he thanked her and turned toward it. Amelia had come down from the 7th floor specifically to be in the lobby at this moment, though she had not told him she would be there, and she was standing near the concierge desk with a cup of coffee, watching. She did not cross the lobby. She did not make the moment into an occasion or announce it to anyone around her. She simply watched him, the coat, the bag, the walk that had not changed, in any essential way, across 15 years and one season of extraordinary events. And when he turned, just before reaching the elevator, and found her standing there, they exchanged the particular look that passes between people who have been through something real together and who understand, without the clumsiness of needing to say it, that they are both still here and that this is the thing that matters, and that it is enough. Amelia raised her coffee cup the smallest increment, a gesture so minimal it would have meant nothing to anyone else in the lobby and meant everything to the person it was directed at. Marcus tilted his chin in the small, precise nod that was his version of a smile, when the feeling behind it was too large for anything more expressive. Then she said, across the quiet lobby, in a voice that was warm and clear, and required nothing from anyone who heard it except the simple act of receiving, "Welcome home, my brother." He stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. The lobby continued around Amelia in its ordinary industry guests, moving through the marble space with their luggage and their purposes, staff attending to the quiet work of a place that has found through the specific education of consequence, what it actually means to extend welcome to every person who walks through its doors without reservation or calculation. The chandeliers did what chandeliers do, which is shine, indiscriminately, on everything below them. Amelia stood for a moment with her coffee, alone in the particular way a person can be alone in a full room, and she thought about the 15 years between the gymnasium and this lobby, about all the mornings she had walked into this building and across this floor without knowing that one November evening would require her to understand it differently, to see in its polished surfaces not only what she had built, but what she had inadvertently sanctioned, and what the distance was between those two things, and what it would take, sustained and unglamorous, and continued long after the original event had faded from anyone's immediate attention, to close it. She thought about Marcus in the elevator, going up to the room he had every right to occupy, carrying the bag with the grant applications and the photograph, continuing without drama or announcement the life he had always lived. She thought about the family in Baltimore waiting on a list. She thought about all the other families in all the other cities waiting on all the other lists for someone to decide that their need was worth responding to not as charity, not as goodwill toward the deserving, but as the simple and non-negotiable acknowledgement that every person's difficulty matters in exactly the proportion that it is real to them, which is to say entirely. Outside on Fifth Avenue, the city moved in its perpetual and indifferent complexity, and the snow, when it came that evening, fell on everyone equally on the stone ledge, near the entrance where a man had once sat in patience and in dignity, while the world made its casual and confident errors around him, and on the steps where a woman had once broken entirely from her composed and professional self and run toward the brother she had spent 15 years looking for across the noise and distance of 2 full lives, and on every other surface of a city, full of people, carrying things that no coat, however worn or however fine, could ever adequately communicate to a stranger who has not yet taken the time to stop and ask. The clothes people wear tell you nothing. The kindness they carry tells you everything.